When Sherry Loeffler first moved into Alder Ridge, she believed she had chosen the kind of community that promised stability, order, and long-term peace. The neighborhood had manicured lawns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and homes that matched each other with an almost uncanny precision. Some people found this rigid uniformity unsettling, but to Sherry, it represented predictability, a place where everyone followed the same rules, where disputes were rare, and where homeowners respected each other's property. Or so she thought. Her home was charming but aging. The original wooden windows, installed decades earlier, had become drafty and warped. During winter, cold air seeped through the cracks, and in summer, the heat came in like an unwelcome guest. She knew replacing them wasn't just cosmetic, it was necessary. Sherry researched her options, wanting windows that would be energy efficient, durable, and in line with the neighborhood's appearance. Vinyl windows checked every box. She compared brands, gathered costs, selected the style that matched the HOA's guidelines, and prepared her application for the Architectural Review Committee. She approached the process with methodical care. She printed the community's entire architectural handbook, highlighted relevant sections, and took photos of her existing windows from multiple angles. On the official form, she filled in every blank space, attaching measurements, brochures, and color swatches. By the time she emailed her application, it was impossible to say she hadn't done her part thoroughly. The approval came quicker than she expected. A formal letter from the Architectural Committee arrived in her inbox, stamped with the committee chair's digital signature. They confirmed that her chosen vinyl windows complied with the neighborhood's appearance requirements and would not disrupt uniformity. Sherry felt relieved. Everything was in writing, an official green light. The installation took 2 days. The contractors were precise, respectful, and clean. When they finished, her home looked refreshed. The white vinyl frames complemented the exterior paint beautifully. The grid pattern matched the homes around hers. Not a single detail seemed out of place. Passers-by even commented on how elegant the upgrade looked. Sherry finally felt like her home belonged perfectly within Alder Ridge's carefully curated aesthetic. For 3 quiet, blissful months, life went on normally. Sherry returned to her routines, morning walks, evening tea on her porch, occasional neighborhood gatherings. But during that time, a change crept quietly into Alder Ridge leadership. A new HOA election had come and gone, and one of the newest board members quickly built a reputation for meticulous, almost obsessive rule enforcement. She roamed the streets with a clipboard and a camera, noting every cracked driveway, every decorative item that exceeded size limits, every mailbox that was a shade too faded. The residents whispered among themselves, calling her the rule hawk, though never to her face. Sherry didn't pay much attention to this new personality. She had her approval, her documents, and her compliant windows. Nothing about her home violated the rules, or so she firmly believed. Then came the morning that shifted everything. A crisp envelope sat in her mailbox, stamped with the HOA's official seal. Inside was a violation notice. The letter stated that her newly installed vinyl windows were not in compliance with Alder Ridge standards and demanded immediate removal and replacement. The tone was cold, stern, and unyielding. Sherry stood frozen in her kitchen as she reread the letter, confusion swirling through her mind. She checked the envelope again, hoping it had been misdelivered. She pulled out her folder of documents, flipping to the approval letter. There it was, undeniably legitimate. The Architectural Committee had approved everything. Her first instinct was simple: this must be a mistake. She emailed the board, attaching the approval. For good measure, she printed copies and hand-delivered them to the HOA office box. She expected a quick apology, maybe even embarrassment from the board for sending the violation without reviewing their records. Instead, the response she received days later felt like a slap. The board stated that the previous committee's approval had been issued in error, and therefore her windows were considered unapproved installations. They claimed the new board was correcting past mistakes and restoring proper standards. No acknowledgement of responsibility, no apology, just a blunt declaration that her approval was meaningless. Within a week, the first fine hit her account. Sherry felt disbelief harden into something stronger, a profound sense of injustice. She had followed every rule precisely, while the board acted as if the rules were malleable depending on who was in charge. Neighbors began to notice something was wrong when the rule hawk started walking past Sherry's home more frequently, snapping photos from the sidewalk. Some residents pretended not to see it. Others made sympathetic eye contact with Sherry, silently acknowledging that they, too, had experienced the HOA's unpredictable enforcement. Word spread quickly. People murmured about how strange it was that the HOA would approve something, then punish someone for obeying the approval. But fear kept most quiet. Alder Ridge had slowly grown more authoritarian under the new board. No one wanted to be the next target. Sherry's sense of comfort in her own home began to unravel. Every time she looked at her windows, perfect, clean, and compliant, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The fines increased weekly, piling up with unsettling speed. What should have been a straightforward improvement had transformed into a looming threat to her finances and her peace of mind. She tried, repeatedly, to reason with the HOA. She sent more letters, attached more documentation, even asked for meetings. The board refused to budge. Their stance remained chillingly identical. The approval was invalid, and she must replace the windows entirely at her own cost. The situation escalated until it no longer felt like a misunderstanding, it felt like a targeted campaign. The fines kept growing, and the board began using language that suggested more severe consequences if she didn't comply. For the first time since moving to Alder Ridge, Sherry felt afraid of her own HOA. It was then, in the quiet of one sleepless night, that she realized this wasn't going to resolve itself. The board wasn't correcting a mistake, they were asserting power. And they expected her to fold. But she wouldn't. She collected every document, every letter, every screenshot. She built a binder thicker than a textbook. She prepared for a battle she never wanted, but one she refused to lose. Because she knew one thing. She had done everything right. And the HOA was wrong. The first fine was small enough that Sherry assumed it was still part of the misunderstanding. The HOA had levied a $100 initial violation fee, which she believed she could dispute easily once she met with someone reasonable. She left a voicemail for the HOA office and sent another email asking for clarification. She was certain the approval she received would settle everything. But the HOA didn't respond. The second fine came a week later. Then the third. Each one larger than the last. The board escalated the penalties, adding late fees that stacked aggressively on top of the running totals. What began as a single wrongful charge rapidly ballooned into something that felt like a financial trap. The tone of the letters also changed. The early notices had been formal but neutral. Now they carried the sharp, calculated language of intimidation, phrases like failure to comply, escalating penalties, and possible legal action. Sherry felt her sense of security thinning more each day as the HOA's posture became increasingly hostile. Neighbors started to notice the change in atmosphere. They saw the HOA president walking the streets more often, holding a binder filled with violation sheets. They noticed the strict board member, the one people half-jokingly called the rule hawk, pausing in front of Sherry's home, scanning every inch of her exterior as if searching for anything that could justify their actions. She carried a camera, snapping photos with an air of authority that made even passers-by uncomfortable. People whispered about it on sidewalks and at mailbox clusters. Many residents had grown wary of the board since the new leadership took over, but what was happening to Sherry felt different. It felt deliberate. Some neighbors wanted to help but feared retaliation. One older woman, known for tending her garden daily, quietly placed a note in Sherry's mailbox saying she had once been warned about having garden tools visible for too long. Another resident shared that he'd been fined for not submitting an architectural approval just to repaint his shutters in the exact same color. The board had grown stricter over time, and now it seemed as though every small infraction, real or imagined, was grounds for punishment. Sherry realized something troubling. The HOA's goal wasn't compliance. It was dominance. They were asserting their power, and she had become their example. Still, she pushed back. She gathered every document, printing duplicates of her approval and assembling a timeline of everything she had done. She sent certified letters requesting a hearing. She filed appeals according to the HOA's own written procedures. But the board didn't engage in any meaningful way. When they responded at all, it was with curt messages insisting that the prior approval was void and that she must replace the windows. Then came an accounting statement from the HOA that left her stunned. The total fines and late fees had accumulated into several $1,000s, far beyond what any reasonable violation could incur. The way the charges were listed looked more like predatory billing than enforcement. Rows upon rows of fines, each one a reminder of the board's absolute refusal to acknowledge the truth. The fear she felt in her own home solidified into something deeper, heavier. She had always believed HOAs existed to protect property values and maintain community harmony. Instead, she was learning firsthand how quickly an HOA with unchecked authority could turn into an adversary more intimidating than any neighbor or stranger. The breaking point came the day she received a document stating the HOA was considering placing a lien on her home. The letter implied she was refusing to pay mandatory assessments, a lie, and suggested the board could pursue foreclosure if the balance remained unresolved. Sherry felt the air leave her lungs as she read the letter. A lien? On her home? For windows they approved? The injustice of it stoked something fierce inside her. Fear turned into anger, and anger into determination. She knew she needed help. She started researching attorneys specializing in HOA disputes. Her search revealed a pattern she hadn't expected. Homeowners across the country had faced nearly identical situations: retroactive rule changes, revoked approvals, and fines deployed like weapons. Some homeowners lost their cases. Others spent years in court. A few won significant settlements after exposing their HOA's misconduct. By the time she sat across from the attorney she eventually hired, her binder of documents had grown thick enough to require two hands to lift. The attorney listened carefully, scanning her approval letter with raised eyebrows. When he looked up, he told her something that both reassured and frightened her. She had one of the clearest cases he'd ever seen, and it was also one of the most intense escalations he had encountered so early in a dispute. He explained that HOAs often doubled down on wrong decisions because admitting a mistake made them appear weak. Boards like hers, especially when dominated by controlling personalities, felt incentivized to stick to their positions even when they were legally indefensible. It was easier to bully a homeowner into compliance than to admit wrongdoing. The attorney helped her draft a formal demand letter, instructing the HOA to cease all fines immediately and acknowledge the original approval. He cited state laws, HOA bylaws, and cases where similar behaviors had been ruled illegal. They sent the letter via certified mail. The HOA ignored it. They continued sending fines, continued posting inflated balances to her account, and continued threatening action. It was clear they expected that no matter how strong her evidence was, they could outlast her. They believed the stress, the expense, and the fear of losing her home would push her to surrender. But Sherry had a quiet strength the board hadn't counted on. She began documenting everything with unnerving precision. She saved copies of every email, every notice, every statement. She started photographing the rule hawk whenever she stopped to take pictures of her house. She attended HOA meetings, sitting quietly in the back as board members avoided eye contact. Residents watched her with a mix of sympathy and concern. They saw her arrive carrying her expanding binder. They saw her leave meetings looking exhausted but not broken. And they noticed that the board grew increasingly tense whenever she was present. Behind closed doors, the board wasn't as confident as they appeared. They knew the approval letter existed. They knew their fines were excessive. And they knew her persistence posed a threat. But rather than retract their actions, they pushed harder, convinced they could overwhelm her. Instead, they pushed her straight into the decision they feared most, the decision to sue. It wasn't a choice she made lightly. It meant years of conflict, legal fees, and stress. But she realized she didn't just owe it to herself, she owed it to every resident who would come after her. If she let the board get away with this, what stopping point would they have? For the first time since the ordeal began, Sherry felt something unusual: clarity. She was done trying to reason with people who refused to acknowledge reality. She was ready to fight. Sherry filed the lawsuit, knowing it could consume years of her life. The HOA immediately responded with an aggressive legal stance, hiring a law firm known for dragging cases out. What should have been straightforward, proving she had written approval, became a massive legal maze. Depositions, hearings, delays, and counterclaims filled the next months. The HOA attempted to shift blame onto the past committee, claiming they had not followed correct procedures. They tried to argue that any approval given was invalid. They argued that the current board's interpretation superseded previous decisions. Every motion seemed designed not to win on merit but to exhaust her financially and emotionally. But Sherry persisted. Her attorney gathered architectural guidelines, past approvals granted to other homeowners, and meeting minutes from the period when her application was finalized. They found inconsistencies in the HOA's enforcement patterns and discovered that several other residents had vinyl windows approved before the new board took over. Those residents were never fined. The HOA, however, refused to back down. The battle dragged on year after year. Sherry lost sleep, time, and stability. She attended court dates, watched her savings drain, and lived under the constant threat of HOA retaliation. Yet she refused to surrender. Meanwhile, the community's opinion shifted dramatically. Residents saw how the board handled the issue, and many realized their authority was being misused. Some called for new board elections. Others emailed anonymously, describing the hostile environment that had taken root. The board responded by becoming even more defensive, tightening control, and enforcing rules selectively. Through it all, Sherry remained steadfast. The case moved slowly, but each delay was another opportunity to gather evidence. Her attorney uncovered key documents proving the approval was legitimate, properly signed, and printed on official HOA stationery. The board's claim that the approval never should have been given became weaker with every hearing. 5 years passed. 5 years of stress, money, and tension. 5 years where her life was overshadowed by something as simple as vinyl windows. Finally, the court set a definitive trial date. Everything was about to be exposed. The courtroom became the arena where the truth finally mattered. For the first time, the HOA board members had to explain themselves under oath. Their confident, authoritarian demeanor faded as the judge questioned inconsistencies in their statements. The key moment came when Sherry's attorney introduced the original approval letter. The document, stamped and signed, was undeniable. The board attempted to argue that the previous committee lacked authority, but the judge emphasized the obvious: homeowners rely on approvals in good faith. Boards cannot retroactively punish residents for following sanctioned procedures. Further evidence showed that other homeowners with similar windows had never been fined. The selective enforcement was obvious and severe. The judge noted that the board's actions were not only unreasonable but potentially retaliatory and abusive. When financial records were reviewed, the inflated fines shocked even seasoned court officials. The judge criticized the HOA's accounting practices and the way the board had escalated charges without following due process. The attempted lien on Sherry's home was labeled improper and inconsistent with state HOA laws. The courtroom atmosphere shifted entirely. What began as a small violation case had transformed into a full-scale exposure of the HOA's mismanagement. Sherry remained calm, watching the truth unfold. After 5 long years, the power dynamic was finally equalizing. The board realized their position was collapsing. Their attorney quietly shifted strategy, seeking damages limitation rather than victory. The judge indicated that a ruling was forthcoming and that the HOA should consider settlement discussions. Sherry, exhausted yet resolute, sat surrounded by documents that represented half a decade of stress. She knew the finish line was close. The HOA, once confident in its authority, now faced its most humiliating defeat. The settlement negotiations were brief. The HOA, backed into a corner by overwhelming evidence, agreed to pay Sherry $75,000 in damages, legal fees, and reimbursement for the stress and financial losses they caused. The agreement mandated that all fines be erased, the lien attempt be reversed, and the HOA formally recognize her windows as compliant. For Sherry, the amount was symbolic. It represented accountability. It proved that homeowners are not powerless when facing unjust boards. It validated every sleepless night, every letter she saved, every meeting she endured, and every moment she felt trapped in her own home. The board members tried to move past the scandal quickly, but the community did not forget. Several residents called for resignations, and 2 board members eventually stepped down. A new, more transparent HOA leadership emerged, committed to preventing abuses of authority. Sherry's case became a quiet legend in Alder Ridge, a reminder that HOAs must follow their own rules and that homeowners with determination and proper documentation can challenge wrongful decisions, no matter how long it takes. As the settlement was finalized, Sherry felt a wave of relief stronger than anything she'd experienced in years. She didn't celebrate with noise or fanfare. She simply walked through her home, touching the vinyl windows that had sparked everything, and felt the weight of the past 5 years lifting. The battle was finally over. The story didn't end with the settlement. Sherry became an advocate for homeowners' rights in her state, offering advice to people facing similar situations. She shared her experience with local homeowner forums, teaching others the importance of documentation, persistence, and understanding their legal protections. Her case influenced neighboring communities as well. Surrounding HOAs reviewed their architectural processes, updated guidelines, and retrained committee members on fair enforcement. Sherry's ordeal reminded them that authority must have accountability. Alder Ridge transformed. The new board installed digital approval systems that stored documents securely, eliminating the excuse of lost paperwork. They held open meetings, created transparent voting systems, and encouraged neighbor participation. The community's atmosphere gradually returned to warmth and trust. As for Sherry, she found peace again. The vinyl windows remained in perfect condition, and every time sunlight passed through them, she felt a quiet sense of victory. They were more than home improvements. They were symbols of resilience. 5 years of conflict had reshaped her life, but it had also restored fairness to her community. She had stood up against an HOA that tried to overpower her with bureaucracy, intimidation, and inconsistent enforcement. And in the end, she won not only compensation but respect from the entire neighborhood. Her story became a cautionary tale, a viral example used in countless HOA discussions online. When an HOA approves first and fines later, the homeowner may win in the end. The long battle had ended, but the lesson would echo for years.